Welcome back to the Wealth Actually podcast, the show that features artists, entrepreneurs, experts, and commentators that will give you the right knowledge, planning, and guidance so you can preserve your assets and enjoy your wealth. Learn more and subscribe today at wealthactually.com. This podcast is for educational and entertainment purposes. It is neither investment, legal, nor tax advice and does not represent the opinions of the employers of the host or guest. And now, here's your host, Fraser Rice.
Welcome back to the Wealth Actually podcast. I'm Fraser Rice. Richard Haass takes us on a tour of the world's hotspots this week. We're also going to discuss the United States in 2024, including the upcoming election. And we're going to talk about the concept of citizenship and his recent book, The Bill of Obligations. Dr. Richard Haass is a veteran diplomat and respected scholar of international relations. He's president emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations after having served as CFR's president for 20 years. Richard is also a senior counselor with Centerview Partners, an international investment banking advisory firm. He appears frequently in the media and has authored several books on American foreign policy, management, and democracy. Welcome aboard, Richard.
Great to be with you, Fraser.
We will get right into it because we're basically just covering the world as it is today. I thought what might make sense is to take a little bit of a tour around the trouble spots around the world. Why don't we start with the one that's getting the lion's share of the headlines right now, and that's Israel, Gaza, and the Middle East in general. What's your general framework around how to analyze this?
A general framework for the Middle East is it's almost useful to think of it as an earthquake zone where you have multiple fault lines, any one of which can go off at any time. If it does, it can actually influence the stability or lack of it or other fault lines. So you've got Gaza, obviously, which has dominated the last 5+ months, but you've got Lebanon and Hezbollah. You've got the situation in the occupation in the West Bank. You've got the Houthis in the Red Sea. You've got Iran, its nuclear program, its support for all these paramilitaries, not to mention the rest of the region. So that's the Middle East. It's been that way for some time now, and there's no signs of it settling down.
So you have Hamas's initial attack and then Israel's reaction back, which is now in the tens of thousands in people who've lost their lives there. I'm having trouble envisioning how the temperature gets taken down. And more specifically, I worry about Hezbollah suddenly becoming involved and this getting taken up to 10x what we're dealing with right now. How do you think about it? And is there a place for optimism here?
Not a whole lot of optimism. It's not clear to me that Hamas has incentive to calm things down. It's gotten an awful lot of international support despite its horrific actions on October 7th. In some ways, the Israeli response has generated a lot of sympathy for Palestinians. The Palestinian issue was on the back burner if it was even on the stove 6 months ago. So from Hamas's point of view, the more friction, the better. And if some of the friction happens during the holy month of Ramadan, which has just begun, so much the better from Hamas's point of view. You mentioned the North. You have a situation now which I think is untenable. Something between 75 and 100,000 Israelis can't live in their homes in northern Israel because of the shelling, the missiles that come from Lebanon, from Hezbollah, which is essentially a state within a state. That is something that probably no Israeli government, not just this right-wing government, could live with. And then you have an Israeli government that is, shall we say, not inclined to compromise. You've got a prime minister who has no desire to leave office, given his legal vulnerabilities. And you've got a coalition that has zero interest in an outcome that would give the Palestinians some of what they want. So, sorry to be so negative, but I don't see the prerequisites of a peace right now. I can paint theoretically an alternative, more positive scenario. The only problem is that the odds of that happening are decidedly less than the more pessimistic future.
What would you be looking at in the coming months as fulcrum events? We're looking at Ramadan right now, which is the holy holiday for Muslims. If we get through that, what does that lead to? Are there any dates on the calendar that you look at as things to keep an eye on?
Not particularly. I think you're looking at probably an open-ended, low-level war. At some point, there'll still be some intense moments, but I think it's over the next few weeks or months, the intensity of the war in Gaza will dial down. I think you're then looking at an open-ended Israeli occupation. The biggest uncertainty in the short run is probably whether the Israeli-Hezbollah relationship takes a decided turn for the worse. But no, I don't see anything that's particularly calendar. What makes this part of the world so worrisome is it's a long list of potential flashpoints. I don't see that list shrinking.
Before we move away from this region of the country, the different oil states, UAE, Dubai, Saudi Arabia, et cetera, they're looking on with this great interest to the point of maybe a lot of fear that this bubbles over into their sphere. What are they looking at right now? Obviously, each one has a slightly different interest in the region. I look at Saudi Arabia and they're trying to modernize and become more worldly by 2030, et cetera. What's the tenor of those types of states?
Well, what you just said is exactly right. The Saudis, the UAE, Bahrain, and others, they want to get on with life. And they want to get on, in particular, with economic modernization, with economic development. Until 5 or 6 months ago, their biggest strategic concern was Iran directly. And they were looking for signs of increased U.S. backing. This is a truly unwelcome set of developments. They want to get closer to Israel, which they see as an economic partner, and this makes it much more difficult. And they don't want to have to worry about regional instability. And this obviously has increased the odds of that. So they are unhappy campers, no disrespect intended. They're unhappy with the United States. They don't think we're doing enough. They're obviously unhappy and frustrated with Israel. And these are governments or countries, not a lot of love lost to the Palestinians. There's a lot of history there. But on the other hand, what this crisis has done is it has awakened a new generation of Arabs to the Palestinian issue. 6 months ago, most young people in the Arab world were not marching or protesting for the Palestinians. That's changed now. So these governments have their hands tied to some extent. And the Saudis in particular, who are on the cusp of normalizing with Israel, have now basically said we can only do that if things calm down and if you, Israel, articulate a credible political path that would satisfy to a meaningful degree Palestinian political aspirations. As is obvious, this Israeli government has no intention of doing anything that resembles that.
It sounds like we've got bottlenecks all around the road in that neck of the woods. Let's move north a little bit here to Ukraine and Russia. What is the state of affairs there?
After 2 years or so of this phase of the war, Ukraine has done remarkably well, thanks to its own abilities as well as U.S. and European help. The problem is in the last few weeks, the tide on the battlefield has begun to shift in Russia's favor. And the only explanation for it is the cutting off of U.S. aid. Just recently, it was announced that $300 million worth of arms and ammunition would go from the U.S. to Ukraine, but this is not even 1% the amount that was in the legislation. The $60 billion plus that was in the legislation died because of Republican policies in the House of Representatives. Again, I think you'll see a gradual erosion, not dramatic, of Ukraine's position over the next few months. I haven't given up on the idea that Congress may come around to do something for Ukraine. There's several legislative mechanisms by which that could happen. I don't know what odds to give you. And if it does happen, then I think Ukraine, it can't liberate the territory it's lost back in 2014, but it can hold its own against the Russians. Bottom line is, no matter what happens or doesn't happen, I think this year the fighting continues. Russia will gain some territory if Ukraine continues to be under-supported by the United States. And then everyone's looking towards the November elections, see what happens, not just with the presidency, but with the composition of the U.S. Congress. And then I think Russia and Ukraine will assess their positions about how they are likely to fare over time, given the backdrop of American politics and its willingness to support Ukraine. So my guess is the war goes on for quite a while. I think it's a question of when more than if diplomacy comes to the fore. And it's not diplomacy to wrap this in a nice package and call it peace. But I can imagine in 2025 or 2026, some type of ceasefire, some type of outcome like that, where each country would keep its own long-term aims. Ukraine wants to recover all of its land. Russia has no interest in separate Ukraine with ties to the EU and NATO. But for various reasons, both sides might come to the conclusion that they're better served by diplomacy. But again, the biggest single factor on their calculations will be what the United States does.
Interesting. Answer me this if you can. And this is more of a medium-term question. What does Russia look like post-Putin? How does it operate? I can't seem to find any good sources on that. I'd be interested in your opinion.
I think Putin will one day be seen as a terrible leader by Russians, someone who in many ways drove the country into a ditch. Economically, there's not a lot to talk about. It's heavily dependent, as you all know, on energy exports. It's separated from Europe and a lot of the world, not all of the world, but a lot of it. It's become the junior partner in many ways to China. I think the day will come. I don't know if it's Putin's successor or his successor's successor. My guess, though, is, and this is what we used to call in the intelligence world gut int. It's an instinct that the day will come when a Russian leader will challenge Putinism and will basically say, look, we've got a shrinking demography. We don't have a modern economy. We're isolated from Europe. We're a pariah state. That's not a future. My guess is it's the successor to Putin's successor. I think it might be too big of a leap from Putin to his immediate successor. And there's things about that in Russian history. The pendulum has swung between what you might call Oriental Russia and European Russia. And I think at some point, a more Western Russia will come to the fore. And I think there's a potential deal there where if Russia were willing to accept Ukrainian sovereignty and so forth, possibly also at that point, Russia would have access to the 300 billion plus in frozen reserves, the resources of theirs that are Western financial institutions. I can imagine a deal that Russia would in some ways get somewhat reintegrated with the West if it were to, more than anything else, change its behavior vis-a-vis Ukraine. But again, as your question suggested, that's not the immediate future. I think that's one or two cycles down the road.
Something we can hope for. You mentioned China and Russia as a junior partner there. Let's talk about them a little bit because they are obviously front and center as it relates to U.S. policy, military, economic, et cetera. Step one, I guess, is Taiwan. And I view that China can, quote unquote, take Taiwan whenever it wants, but there are lots of extenuating circumstances around that may not make that advisable, both regarding the U.S. and beyond. It disabuse me of that. What's their thought process around Taiwan at this point, do you think?
I don't agree with that. I think the last couple of years, what's happened in Ukraine has actually sobered the Chinese up a bit. And by that, I mean, it shows what the West can do if it's so inclined. It also shows that it's very easy to overestimate your own military. And China's not fought a major war since the 70s when it fought Vietnam and didn't do so well. Its military lacks real-world experience. Its generals lack battlefield experience. Also, China is potentially more vulnerable to economic sanctions than was Russia because China is a much more integrated economy. So I don't think the Chinese are ready to do anything rash. I think, again, coming back to a theme here, they want to see what happens in November, and they want to see what the leadership in the United States is inclined to do in terms of making good on commitments we have with Taiwan about defense spending and so forth. I think also the Chinese want to see what happens in Ukraine, whether this temporary interruption in U.S. aid is temporary and the aid is resumed or whether it becomes permanent. So I think that will have also an impact. And then China has a whole range of options if it ever were to want to put coercive pressure on Taiwan. I think the least likely thing is an amphibious assault. It's the hardest type of military operation to contemplate. But I can imagine all sorts of lesser things that would take place, particularly in a context where the United States were seen as abandoning Ukraine and maybe not there for Taiwan. Then I think it sets up potentially a different dynamic between the mainland and Taiwan. So I think for the time being, it's wait and see. 2024 is going to be a decent year in U.S.-Chinese relations. The two presidents met in San Francisco in November of last year. They each wanted, albeit for different reasons, a calmer relationship. China doesn't want to see new economic sanctions, new limits on trade or investment. The last thing Joe Biden needs is another geographical hotspot. He's got enough on his plate just now. So I think each wants to calm things down in 2024, but just that. They want to calm it down this year. And I think as for the future, we'll see. So again, I don't think there's anything immediate about Taiwan. You got the new government taking over in Taiwan this spring, but I think there's nothing is solved either. This is a difference or a set of differences that's been finessed for close to half a century now. And I think the issue is not whether you can solve it or put it to rest, it's whether you can continue to finesse it. And that's up to the United States and China. I'd say it's increasingly up to China, whether they're prepared to do that. And the best way to keep them in the game of finessing, which is what we want, is for them to perceive that the risks and costs of acting against Taiwan are far greater than the potential benefits. But we'll see. And I think one other factor here is whether a worsening Chinese economy increases the disposition of some of China to say, hey, we can't do as well as we used to in satisfying the public through economic performance. Maybe we need to think about foreign policy legitimizing the government. I think that's a danger. And again, we have to disabuse anyone who thinks that. And the best way we disabuse them is through credible deterrence.
Let's shift over to one of China's neighbors, and that's India. And I bring that up not because I really hear about any tumult associated with it, but because of its population, which it sounds like it's about as big as China right now, which doesn't get a lot of news.
It passed China a few months ago.
To me, that seems like a sleeping giant out in that region and something that we don't hear much about. How do you think about India in the context of this foreign international relations world? And are they ready to step up to the plate and be more of a factor in that role?
On the foreign policy side, I would argue that India wants to not quite step up to the plate. They maybe want to get into the on-deck circle or get a little bit closer, but they want to keep their options open. India has a tradition of non-alignment. That's the fancy word. Hedging is probably the more accurate word. They did it during the Cold War. Now they continue to import the lion's share of their arms from Russia. India, along with China, is one of the two biggest purchasers of Russian energy. So yes, India wants to get a little bit closer to the United States. It's a member of various security arrangements, but I wouldn't exaggerate it. And I don't know any U.S. defense official who could be confident that under any scenario, India would be there with us and for us. So I think strategic India is somewhat exaggerated. You know, we now call this part of the world, we the U.S. government, we call it the Indo-Pacific. And I think that's slightly more aspirational than it is anything else. I think where India is more significant is economic, just given the scale of the economy, its rate of growth at 7-8%. Even though the per capita situation doesn't improve that much, the overall size of the economy keeps growing, and you've got several 100 million who are quote unquote middle class. I think one of the big questions about India is something else, which is how political India evolves. This spring, Prime Minister Modi will win overwhelmingly in an election. In part, he is the dominant figure in Indian politics. The opposition is really weak and fractured. But he also is making into something of an illiberal democracy, a little bit less secular, more what you might call a Hinduized. And then the question is, what are the long-term repercussions of this? India's had a social peace. You've probably got between 200 and 250 million Muslims in India. India is one of the 2 or 3 largest Muslim countries in the world now. And the question is, does India maintain social tranquility, stability, cohesion? And I think the fact that I could raise the issue tells you that there's something of a potential problem. But the area where India, for all the difficulties, is probably the most intriguing to outsiders is economic.
Let's veer back closer to the U.S. Haiti, which is in the news for all sorts of reasons. What the heck is going on down there? And is that the symptom of something larger in the Caribbean states or South America generally?
Haiti's much worse than most places in the Americas or anywhere else. It's, to use the phrase, sui generis. You know, it's a longer conversation. There's something just inherently and deeply wrong with Haiti. And this gets me into areas that you get into trouble. But there's something wrong with the political culture of Haiti. And there's just something deeply broken. I guess that's the word I would use, broken about that country and about that society. And we see it time and time again. It can't get out of its own way. I'm not enough of an expert to say exactly why it's so broken, what cultural and historic and other factors have led into it, but it is where it is. And I don't see it improving significantly. Right now, it's really deteriorated, but even Haiti at its best is a very, very poor, difficult or impossible to rule, dangerous place. I remember after the recent earthquakes, friends of mine were flying planes down there and delivering medical supplies and ultimately gave up because you couldn't provide security for the pilots and the crews, and you couldn't see that the supplies got into the hands of people who needed them. Instead, they got taken by the gangs. Haiti's a good example. It's a textbook example, unfortunately, of what you would call a weak state. The first part of our conversation was about strong states, the Russias, the Chinas. One could add to that Irans, the North Koreas. It's strong, at least militarily, if not across the board. Haiti's weak in every way. There's no real institutions. There's no real governance. There's no effective military or police. It's the breakdown of border. And I just don't see how it turns around. And I have some very unfashionable ideas about what it would take, but it would take a degree of international involvement, essentially taking away its effective sovereignty for a transitional period, rebuilding the state, rebuilding institutions. We're talking about probably a decade to 2 decade long process. And I'm not sure outsiders have the stomach for that, given the cost, because it would be resisted by certain groups within Haiti. So my guess is, I don't mean to be pessimistic on lots of issues. My guess is we're going to be dealing with Haiti that's going to be essentially a failed country for the foreseeable future.
Let's go back to something that isn't a failed country, and hopefully we get back into the strong state world, and that's the U.S. We are on the throes of an election between Trump and Biden. Looks pretty certain that they're going to be the nominees, absent some sort of health issue. What are you looking out for now that we've seen the dust settle and the primary season's effectively over?
Well, I think you're right. Technically clinched their nominations, and short of a major medical event for President Biden, he's the Democratic candidate. Short of a medical event, conceivably a legal event. I can imagine that if Mr. Trump were convicted of certain things, it could cause real problems if it were to happen, say, before the Republican convention this summer, which is highly, highly unlikely, in part because the Supreme Court, for reasons that are inexplicable, I would argue, agreed to hear the case about presidential powers and immunity from prosecution. So it's far more likely the political calendar outruns the legal calendar. So I think you're right. One would have to work under the assumption that it's Trump versus Biden. This November will affect it. Third parties could have an impact, from Princeton professors to RFK Jr. to no labels to who knows what. So I think with someone like a Cornel West, worthy to be get on the ballot in some states, possibly because of Gaza, could maybe pick up a couple of percent of the vote of young people or people of color, and that could have an impact. If you subtract out the massive popular votes in California and New York, which swing Democratic, the other 48 states are essentially pretty evenly divided in the popular vote. Then comes down to the electoral vote, half dozen swing states, and nobody's smart enough to predict it, but it looks close. I think the president will probably have some economic wins at his back. It's not clear to me he's going to have a good situation in the Middle East. Not clear to me he's going to have a good situation on the border. I'm not smart enough to know how this is going to play out. What I'd simply say is what's so interesting about this election is normally when you have American presidential elections, the similarities between the two leading candidates far outweigh any differences. And I'm older than you are, but this was true even, say, in 1964 when Johnson ran against Goldwater. We thought that was a choice, not an echo. Well, it turned out actually there was more echoing than people realized. Well, now we really do have a choice, not an echo. The difference between these two candidates, not in everything, but in many things, is extraordinary in terms of their fidelity to democracy, in terms of their view of government, in terms of their approach to the architecture of American foreign policy. They are really in different end zones. Normally, presidents operate within the 40-yard lines on one side of the field or the other. It's not the case here. We've got a very different outcome depending upon who wins. And I think you've also got to think about, for investors, the period after the election. Do we have a contested outcome from, say, November through January? And then you've got the question of what happens after January. And I think there's issues of political violence at worst on a larger scale. And even short of that, do we just simply have gridlock and dysfunction? And I don't know what will be the congressional outcome, but it's not a stretch to think that Republicans take the Senate and Democrats take the House. So we have a reversal. And so we could, again, have tremendous difficulty in getting legislation passed, whether it's legislation that affects aid to Ukraine or the border or just about anything else. So it's hard to be wildly upbeat right now about American politics, just given how divided the country is and given the differences between these two candidates.
2 points around that, but the first one is the health of the economy. The statistics indicate things are in pretty good shape. Generally speaking, inflation seems to be under some control. Unemployment seems to be okay. Things seem to be normalizing, but there is a lot of data out there that seems to indicate that people don't feel that way, that they feel left behind, that the income disparity is particularly acute How do you think about that in terms of the overall, let's call it the zeitgeist of the voter and which way they may shift on that one side or the other vote that we're talking about presidentially, even if you go down to the governors and the Congress people, et cetera?
First of all, I can't disagree with anything you said. The objective situation is better than the perceived situation with voters. That said, if I were a betting man, which of course I'm not, but if I were a betting man, I think that between now and the election, the economy would become slightly more of a plus for President Biden as people get more comfortable with things. Employment's really good. Inflation is low. I think you'll probably have at least one, maybe two rate cuts between now and November. So all things being equal, I would think that this gap between realities and perceptions narrows slightly, not fundamentally, but slightly. Also, a lot of this reflects not just some short-term things about some inflation that's been built into food prices, mortgage rates being at just under 7%, which is higher than natural 3 or 3.5% that we all enjoyed. I don't know about you, but I've had several mortgages where I wish I could have gotten them at 7%.
No, exactly. I am deaf to the complaints of 7%, frankly.
I had double-digit mortgages. I'm struck by the lack of historical perspective on that. But my guess is this will not be an election. You know, the old Clinton mantra, it's the economy, stupid. I don't think that's the thing this time. It might be it's the border, stupid, or it might be something else, or just be the gap, or Biden's age, or Trump's character or lack of it. My guess is a pretty good economy almost takes the economy out of the equation as a dispositive phenomenon. And particularly for those who don't feel that it's good, because a lot of the problems people are experiencing economically are not cyclical problems. They're fundamental, where they don't have the skill set or whatever you want to call it to succeed in this economy. It's particularly hard for men in their 50s, 60s, whatever, who got out of the workforce early and can't really re-enter it. So there's nothing that Jay Powell or others can realistically do that's going to affect their prospects or their circumstances. And those people are going to remain disaffected. That's potentially, by the way, a lot of these people were former Democrats. And I think that's going to help Donald Trump.
Let's touch on one of those fulcrum issues, and that's immigration and the border. From my perch here in New York, it is acute as an issue. We talk about hotels being used as housing for migrants, people being shipped up to New York from different parts of the border. Then you have the people who are at the border states who are seeing it right up close. So it's a real thing. But how much of a real thing is it in terms of people making choices politically in your mind?
I think it is a real thing. I think it represents lawlessness. And if you look around the world, just take a step back from the United States, what has been the issue that's most galvanized populism around the world? It's been immigration. Think about the European elections and elsewhere. It doesn't happen in places like Asia because they don't allow immigration. But where immigration is a possibility, mainly Europe, it's really moved things to the right. Whether it was Germany, we're seeing it in France and elsewhere. I think it's real, both symbolically because of the lawlessness it represents, and people just see it around them. And look, and I'll be honest with you, it cuts across party lines. It's wrong. I think this administration made a mistake early on by signaling that the border was more open than it should have been. By the way, I'm a great believer in legal immigration. I'm a great believer in comprehensive immigration reform, but that's not what we've had. The numbers have been off the charts. And then you had the cynical move by the Republicans taking their cue from Donald Trump not to agree to legislation that wouldn't have solved the problem, but it certainly would have reduced the scale of the problem. So it's now, people are putting politics before country. And again, the reason they're doing it, quite honestly, is Donald Trump believes, and he may be right here, that he will benefit politically, even if the reason we haven't had some progress is because he has blocked it. When you're president like Joe Biden is, you get blamed for things, whether they're your fault or not, and you get credit for things, whether you brought them about. And that's just the way it works if you're the incumbent. And Donald Trump is playing the outsider. And on this issue, it's working to his benefit.
The true head coach syndrome. You're not out there necessarily playing, but you're the one who establishes the culture and the direction. And if it works, you get the glory. And if it doesn't, that's on you as well.
We can talk, by the way, if you want, about free agency and what impact it's had on the Giants. I got really strong views on that if you want to go ahead.
As a Commander fan, I'm watching as we get a lot of veterans staffing roles that were depleted for a long time. I don't know where we're going to go with that, but hopefully maybe we can get a new quarterback too. But quick question here. So I'm rooted from an optimism standpoint that With a lot of the people that I talk to who are just so frustrated with Biden v. Trump, and really most Gen Z people have had Biden, Trump, and Hillary Clinton as the only presidential candidates that they've had exposure to. I look at 2 years after the presidential election, probably after the midterms, as an area where Trump or Biden, as lame ducks, are going to be functionally out of long-term influence of either party. The benches, from an executive standpoint, are shallow on both sides. Is this a potential area where both parties have to get back into the debate of actual ideas and developing competent people? Or am I, Pollyanna here, looking for something good in an area where it just may not be?
I guess I don't see it quite that way. First of all, I think Biden will ultimately fade from the scene, win or lose this time, but Trump may not. Trumpism could have a hold for quite some time. He's got a following, shall we say, is devout. A lot of younger people in the Hawleys and the J.D. Vances, you've got people now in the House and the Senate who have taken their cue. There's in some ways a new Republican base. So I'm not sure you have a return to quote unquote normal, in part because the Republican Party is no longer a conservative party. So one of the real questions, though, is what happens to a post-Trump Republican Party? Does it, one way or another, move back in the direction of Reaganism, Bushism, conservatism? Someone like Nikki Haley will probably try to take it there in 2028. But my guess is others will say they're the real heirs to Trump. And given Republican primaries and all that, my guess is people like that will have the upper hand. So I'm not sure you have a bounce back there. And I worry on both sides about the paucity of ideas. And because of how we choose our presidents and primaries and so forth. Look, I live in New York. This is a good example of a city. It's run by a single party. And to the extent there are ideas, the only difference is between the left and the far left. There's not a lot that, shall we say, is centrist, much less remotely conservative. We already talked about the Republican side. So I'm not sure this is a political environment where real ideas are going to be surfaced and then gain traction. I worry about it, hope I'm wrong. I'm a little bit pessimistic.
One of the great contributions I think you've made to the discussion around this is around the importance you place on being a good citizen. And you wrote a book called The Bill of Obligations, which I read and really enjoyed because it, to me, sort of reaffirms that being lucky enough to be a citizen of the U.S. comes with responsibilities to it. I look at that. And first of all, what prompted you to write the book? You're a busy guy. You got a lot going on. This, to me, is a really good thing you've done for a lot of people who end up reading it. What prompted you to do that?
Well, first of all, thank you. I appreciate it. I needed a break from my golf game, which was a great source of frustration to me. So I was forced back on writing another book. No, the serious answer is in my own thinking. And then every once in a while, I listen to what I say. And when I was asked the question about what worries me most in the world of what I normally traffic in, foreign policy, my answer was increasingly us. Yes, I worry about China and Russia and North Korea and Iran and climate change and all that. But what I really worried about it was not ability, but our willingness to meet these challenges and whether our political divisions or polarization would preclude that. And that's what led me to write the book. It's something I think has gone seriously off the rails in this country, where we're totally obsessed with our rights and what we're owed. We don't think at all, or most of us don't think about our obligations, what we owe to one another, what we owe to this country of ours. So I decided to write a book. And there's some things that I think can be fixed over time through policy. For example, there ought to be many more public service opportunities that are well funded for Americans, which not only would give people useful training, but would bring together Americans who would normally never meet one another. And I think there ought to be much more in the way of civics in classrooms at the high school and college level, that we ought to prepare people to be functioning citizens, teach them how to navigate information in this age of, shall we generously call it, abundance, that they need to learn some of the basics of the democratic tradition and what's expected of citizens. And I wanted to highlight the behaviors and attitudes that I thought were necessary for democracy to prosper and to thrive. And I wanted to start a national conversation about these issues. I wanted a lot of schools, when students show up on campus, well, why isn't this part of the first year experience for college kids to talk about these issues and how do they conduct dialogue and deal with differences on campus? For many of them, that's their first experience, where not everybody looks the same or goes to the same church or has a similar economic background. Essentially, I wanted Americans to start thinking much more about the fragility of democracy along with its value. And then again, start a conversation about what needs to be done. Look, we're just over 2 years away from celebrating the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. I don't take anything for granted anymore. As anyone listening to this has figured out, I'm a serial worrier. But when I worry about things, doesn't mean I'm fatalistic. I don't give up. I worry about the threat to things I value, whether it's this, threats to American democracy here at home, or the threats to our position in the world. So I worry about them, and that's why I write and talk about them all the time, whether it's you and I having this conversation or I do a weekly newsletter, Home and Away. I want these ideas out there in the public.
They're valuable. Please keep doing it. What writers do you enjoy reading, or what sort of information do you enjoy taking in as you keep current on the world?
There's several really good daily newspapers. So I think anybody should read the Wall Street Journal or the Financial Times or the New York Times or the Washington Post or something like that. I like The Economist as a weekly magazine. One of my friends, John Ellis, puts out a daily Substack newsletter called News Items. It's the single best compilation I know. Maybe every day he'll take 15 stories and summarize them. And a lot of them are not things I would come across because they deal with science or medicine and all that, in addition to politics and economics. Full disclosure, I'm a very small investor in it, so I don't want anyone to think there's a conflict of interest here, but it really is a valuable newsletter on Substack. And there's certain places on TV you can get longer form conversations. I think David Weston's show on Bloomberg is a really good show. Fareed Zakaria on Christiane Amanpour on CNN do serious shows. I do a morning show several times a week, Morning Joe. People can decide whether it's to their. I would just say be really wary of social media. I remind people it's called social media, not serious media. So don't make that your news source. And more broadly, we live in an era where information and news is polarized. So two things. One is multi-source it. Don't just listen to Fox or watch Fox or MSNBC. Crossover. And be discerning about what it is you're reading or watching. Not every source of information is the same. Some publications separate the editorial page from the reporting page. Some don't. Some traffic in facts, not all. It's one of the reasons I'm so big on the idea that information literacy and information hygiene ought to be a part now of civics education. I think we have to strengthen the ability of consumers to be discerning consumers of information.
As we wind up here, I could probably keep you tethered to the Zoom here for hours because this is really interesting for me. But what's worrying you, or what are you excited about that isn't really well known that you think out in the public discourse? Is there something that is just keeping you up at night that you think that the general public isn't sure about? Or is there something that you're really excited about that hasn't been discovered yet?
I'll give you one negative and one positive. The negative is the one that we've been talking about a little bit, which is the threats to American democracy. I think there's a tendency to take it for granted. What I implore people to do is don't take it for granted. It's precious, it's valuable, but it's vulnerable. It's hard to sustain a democracy. It's a little bit like oxygen. We all benefit from the rule of law and the benefits of democracy, the creativity and innovation that it allows, but we don't do enough to support the democracy. So I worry there. On the positive side, I'm a great believer in technology. We got through COVID. Why? Because of two technologies, mRNA vaccines and Zoom. Without those two, it would have been a very different experience, far worse than it was. So I'm very optimistic about technology, say, for climate change. I don't think the diplomats who meet once a year and late in the year are going to accomplish much of anything. But I do think the scientists will. And ultimately, out of these public-private partnerships and out of these labs, there'll be the breakthroughs in alternative energy or ways of dealing with carbon or ways of reflecting sunlight that I think will actually help us deal with climate change, which otherwise has the potential to be the existential challenge of this era. I actually think it won't, because I think technology will ultimately give us the upper hand there.
Great stuff. We talked a little bit about where to find your writing, your appearances, et cetera, but maybe just give it one more so that people can end understanding where to find you.
Every Friday morning, I put out something called Home and Away. It's on Substack.com. Substack, for those of you who don't know what it is, it's long form. It's a form of social media. It's long form. And if you go and you type in my name, Richard Haass, or Home and Away, you will find it. And it's my assessment of domestic and international developments every week. And in it, I include links to the articles I publish regularly in certain newspapers and certain websites, or I flog my books mercilessly and shamelessly. If you're not shameless, you don't succeed as an author. I do a lot of TV and radio, but you mentioned the most recent book, which is on the Bill of Obligations on democracy. But most of the books before then were books about foreign policy or international relations. The most recent before that was a book called The World, A Brief Introduction. And it's just that. It was meant to be a primer for people who aren't experts about the world and essentially how it operates and what they need to know in order to make sense of it.
Terrific. Richard, thanks so much for being on. Look forward to following your writing and your commentary with great interest. I think it really helps us to understand not only what's going on around us, maybe if we're not using our passports as much as we like, but also as a way to understand what we are internally as a country and a people. I think you're doing a lot and a great service. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Fraser. Very generous. Enjoyed the conversation, and you take care.
Will do.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Wealth Actually, hosted by Fraser Rice, author of the book Wealth Actually and a leading private wealth manager. Head on over to wealthactually.com where you can subscribe to this podcast, get your own copy of the Wealth Actually book, and connect with Fraser directly. We'll see you next time on Wealth Actually. Fraser Rice is an employee of Next Capital Management, LLC. This podcast is not investment, legal, or tax advice, nor does it reflect the opinions of Next Capital Management. Any opinions represented in the show are Fraser's individually and not an endorsement of the guest.